We're going to start with some questions for planning that would be familiar to you if you attended our cluster day in the last few months. And if you haven't, they should be easy enough to follow. These questions might help guide your department's collaborative planning as you start to look at what you might start doing in September. So the first question is, what do we want our students to learn? Next, we want to ask, where are they in their learning journey? Next, we want to have a look at what resources we might use to support their learning. We also want to ask how we can check in on their learning. How can we find an answer to the first question? How will we know that they've learned what we intended them to? And finally, how can the learning outcomes from Strand 1 support and enhance the students' engagement with learning outcomes from the contextual strands 2 and 3? So what we've done tonight is we've taken these planning questions and we've created an approach to planning to include each of them. In blue here are the learning outcomes, strands and elements, and action verbs, which will help us to decide what students need to know. In green, we have prior learning and where do we go next? So we can be thinking about what students know already and what learning outcomes we might want to move on to next. In orange, we've included teaching and learning strategies and resources we might already have in our school or might be readily available. And in red, we consider assessment. How might we check that the students have learned what we considered earlier in the blue pane? The purple shows us possible links to other learning outcomes from other strands. And then finally in yellow, we're going to introduce you now to 3 possible planning approaches over the next few minutes to add that yellow piece to the jigsaw. And we've presented these considerations as a jigsaw because each of them is connected to the others. No potential plan would be complete without thinking about each of these areas. So we're going to focus on providing guidance on possible approaches to collaborative planning of units of learning, using the learning outcomes from the Junior Cycle History specification, which can support the integration of learning outcomes from across the unifying and contextual strands. Each of the approaches we outline are supported by the specification. And we're going to look at 3 different approaches to planning. As you can see, an inquiry-focused approach, a big picture approach, and a contextual approach. These approaches are backed by education research into how to present students with history in the classroom, which we will share with you via our website in due course. As we go through each of these 3 approaches, we'll share with you a potential framework to help structure your collaborative planning as a department, and a worked example of this framework that we've created as a team. Finally, we'll show you worked examples of how these frameworks can be used to support individual teachers creating the schemes of work for their classrooms using 2 distinct tools. Now, our specification states that by asking questions of available evidence, students of history can make rational, informed judgments about human actions in the past and examine why people were motivated to act as they did and the effects of these actions. This makes an inquiry-focused approach an interesting plan to consider. So we're going to have a look at that one first. So to plan using an inquiry-focused approach. This approach to planning is to focus a unit around an inquiry question. This will allow students to structure their learning while fostering a spirit of historical inquiry and developing the skills of the historian. The initial big question that can be broken down into a series of smaller or component questions that will aid students' engagement with the personalities, issues, and events involved. This approach can be used to plan a taster or sample course for first years where history has become an optional subject. It also facilitates the integration of local history and therefore begins the process of equipping students with the knowledge, skills, and understanding, and indeed the values that they will demonstrate in their CBAs. To begin planning for the inquiry-focused approach, it can be helpful to focus on a contentious or controversial period in history. As we are developing historical consciousness and empathy, it will be important for students to consider multiple perspectives. Here, we have a blank framework to facilitate planning around an inquiry question. Now we'll look at how we can populate this in our collaborative planning. A starting point might be the question, how should World War I be remembered in Ireland? This encourages students to consider the place of commemoration in their cultural inheritance, while examining the issues and events involved during the war years in Ireland. Once we've decided on a question to focus the learning, we can think about what else we need to consider. The action verb, for example, at the start of a learning outcome, is of course an important focus. A learning outcome that facilitates this approach and this topic is the learning outcome 2.8, which reads, describe the impact of war on the lives of Irish people, referring to either World War I or World War II. Now, bearing in mind that the incoming first years in September might have been actively involved in the decade of centenaries in their primary schools, we can assume that they have at least some prior knowledge of the events of 1914-1918 in Ireland. This also links with learning outcome 1.3, which reads that students should learn to appreciate their cultural inheritance through recognizing historically significant places and buildings and discussing why historical personalities, events and issues are commemorated. In addition, of course, given that 2018 marks 100 years since many women were granted parliamentary voting rights and the end of the Great War, it's an important aspect of the big picture. This might allow us to consider learning outcome 211, make connections between local, personal or family history and wider national and or international personalities, issues and events. So earlier we showed you a blank version of this slide. Having considered the action verb, we can move into our planning by breaking our inquiry question down into more manageable and focused component questions. We can think about the resources and learning experiences that scaffold student research. For example, the My Adopted Soldier project, local libraries, specific field trips to sites of interest, such as the trench experience at Cavan County Museum, as well as the wealth of source material available locally and online. Remembering that the intended outcome of this unit is that students will be able to describe the impact of World War I on the lives of Irish people, it is important that students examine the various voices from that time and collaborate and cooperate to develop historical judgments. So, constructing timelines and profiles, interview questions and role play are just a few teaching and assessment and learning opportunities. The research project, which is evidence-based and inquiry-focused, could be presented in a variety of ways, while students will perhaps have the opportunity to reflect on their learning in a historian's journal. We can also see that students will have engaged with the range of learning outcomes in Strand 1, as well as others in Strand 2 and in Strand 3. Our junior cycle history specification also states that a rapidly taught big picture of the past can be revisited and developed regularly over the 3 years of students learning in junior cycle. The aspiration for students here is for them to acquire the historical skills, conceptual understanding and substantive knowledge that will lead them to developing a sense of historical consciousness. This will enable 12 to 16-year-olds to be able to see the world and their place in it from a historical perspective. In order for this to happen, students will need to be given the opportunity to formulate an overarching framework of the past, or as we call it, a big picture of the past. The development of a big picture of the past can be supported while forming learners' chronological awareness through the creation and maintenance of timelines. Working with timelines could also provide students with an appreciation of date patterns, eras, or ages of change. This is a blank framework to support the big picture approach that might be useful when you're starting to plan. It could be tweaked and adapted to include the thinking and creativity within your department and to meet the needs of your particular students. Examples of a big picture theme could include religion, technology, or conflict, themes that have a lasting influence across the broad course of history. We chose 2 learning outcomes from acquiring the big picture element of Strand 1. 110, which reads, demonstrate chronological awareness by creating and maintaining timelines to locate personalities, issues and events in their appropriate historical eras. 111, make connections and comparisons between people, issues and events in different places and historical eras. The 2 learning outcomes from the contextual strand, Strand 2 and Strand 3, about the impact of religion on history, both in Europe and in the wider world, and subsequently in Ireland. 3.8 says, consider the historical importance of religion with particular reference to Reformation. 2.6 says, consider the historical significance of Christianity on the island of Ireland, including its contribution to culture and society in the early Christian period. And as this approach incorporates a rapidly thought big picture of history of religion, the plan doesn't aim to deal with the complete learning outcomes from the contextual strand. You can see, for example, we've struck some of this out. We could use them to provide context to the timelines and comparisons which are core to the Strand 1 learning. And in this example of a rapidly taught big picture approach, it should be clear that it isn't necessary to cover the entirety of each learning outcome. It's possible to revisit a learning outcome to complete it at a later date. For the purposes of this plan, a teacher might return to the Reformation or the early Christian period. We've struck those out, as I've said, in the plan, so you might return to them to complete the consideration of the learning outcomes at a later date. This is the populated plan we shared as a blank earlier. You can see it followed the layout of the earlier plan we described, answering the planning questions we posed at the beginning of this section and on our cluster day. The creation and maintenance of timelines by students is fundamental to the new history specification. This approach supports the creation of a timeline that spans all the historical eras and ages of the course that the students could update and maintain over the course of 3 years. It also uses maps to support the students in being able to orientate themselves in relation to historical events. Now let's move on to a contextual approach. Strands 2 and 3 provide the context for students to deepen their understanding of the nature of history as a discipline. Therefore, the learning outcomes in Strand 1 will be integrated with those in Strand 2 and 3. This is the blank framework to support a contextual approach. It might be useful as a starting point to plan as a collaborative department, but as I said before, it could also be tweaked and adapted to include the thinking and ideas and the creativity within your own subject department in your school. And of course, we should consider the needs of our own particular students. When planning for September 2018, some teachers might choose to take a contextual approach, and students may begin their learning journey in first year with an ancient or medieval civilization. This unit of work is based around the learning outcome 3.1, which reads, investigate the lives of people in one ancient or medieval civilization, explaining how the actions and or achievements of that civilization contributed to the history of Europe and or the wider world. As we know now, Strand 1, the nature of history, should underpin all the engagement with the key personalities, issues and events of Strand 2 and 3. Therefore, we have also chosen learning outcome for Strand 1 to start off with. 1.6, debate the usefulness and limitations of different types of primary and secondary sources of historical evidence, such as written, visual, oral and tactile evidence, and appreciate the contribution of archaeology and new technology to historical inquiry. And here now is what the plan might look like after collaborating with the rest of your department. Learning outcome 3.1 highlights the choice and flexibility in the history specification. This approach looks at the learning outcome from a general department perspective, and it will be followed up on the next slide by 2 different classroom approaches that could be adapted while staying within the department plan. When we start to plan, we should first consider the elements and learning outcomes the students will engage with during this unit of learning. This particular contextual learning outcome, 3.1, deals with the element recognizing key change, which means students will engage with this learning outcome through the lens of change. They will do this through the element working with evidence. We must also consider the action verbs to understand the depth that students will engage at. Here, the action verbs are investigate, explain, debate, and appreciate. When unpacking a learning outcome, you should consider the historical topics or key learning that might relate to the learning outcome. This learning outcome says an ancient or medieval civilization could be chosen. Students are asked to investigate both the lives of people from that civilization and the actions or achievements of that civilization and their contribution to Europe and the wider world. In the Strand 1 learning outcome, the key learning is around work with primary and secondary sources, evidence, and the contribution of archaeology. After your department has made a link with Strand 1 and decided on the historical topics that students will engage with, it's also important to consider new historical concepts that are also key learning and may be new to our first year students. A different approach might use Padlet, which would be a helpful tool when planning a unit of learning. Padlet is an app and website which can be used to build ideas either individually or collaboratively. This is a screen grab at the planning page at padlet.com. It would be ideal for a group of history teachers in a school to collaboratively visualize their planning. So, following on from the contextual department plan that we saw earlier, this teacher has developed the department plan further to suit the needs of students in their particular class. Using Padlet as a tool for planning can be beneficial as it can be easily shared and edited after a lesson. We begin here with a look at what we might have done prior to starting with our Learning Outcome 3.1, which is in blue. Before teaching 3.1, it is envisaged here that students might look first at Learning Outcome 1.5 on the job of the historian, the first pink panel. That background in Strand 1 would be a good way to begin and would fit with learning in 6th class for earning students. That brings us back to the earlier department plan structure and to the heart of this unit, Learning Outcome 3.1 on ancient or medieval civilization. This particular teacher has decided to choose the Normans, again a topic students might be familiar with from primary school. The planning questions in white are the ones we've seen before tonight, and are the same ones we use in the workshop. We could also make links with other learning outcomes from both Strand 1 and 2. 1.6 on the reliability of sources could be covered here, and we could keep an eye on the Irish aspect of this unit by looking at Learning Outcome 2.6. We need to also take into account what the students will know at the end of the unit, and that's what the inquiry question is driving at. Why was everyone in the Middle Ages called Norman? In green, we've included some resources that might be used in history class already. Lastly, we thought we should look at how we might check in on the students' learning as we proceeded. Using the bio tapestry as a model for a timeline might be one interesting way of assessing progress. In the last post, you can see where we decided we might go next. As an alternative to these earlier plans, this particular teacher has decided to choose ancient Rome as the key learning, with reference to the excavation of Pompeii. As you can see, there are rich learning activities and formative assessment opportunities built into this plan. There are also clear success criteria to evaluate the student learning. Although this plan is unique to the teacher and meets the needs of our particular students, it is reflective of the collaborative departmental planning that we saw in the earlier department plan.